a book that came out last year called The Irresponsible Self. Because you remember, I was talking about Peter Eisenman and being invited. Some of you will probably be invited to such things. I was always fascinated by James Watson, who always said, "I never had an exceptional mind." Now, for the man who cracked DNA, that's quite a statement. James Watson, who won the Nobel Prize for his DNA work with Francis Crick, says, "I never had an exceptional mind. I was just very focused and impatient." If a lecture or book begins with confusion, becomes extremely bored with itself, and ends possibly with the same confusion that it had when it set out, is it an irresponsible lecture or book? If architecture operated similarly, would it be irresponsible architecture? Around the time in India when I finished that rather big book I spoke about called Writing Architecture, I began thinking about irresponsibility. Various events seemed to go together. Something in this insistence and persistent relativism of these events in the early 1990s invited in me an expression of absolute disinterest with architecture, particularly its so-called trends, movements, its court kings and queens, its royal discourses and anti-discourses, its failing pedagogy, its seminar circuits, its Illuminati and cognoscenti, its Peters, its Franks, and its Michaels. To continue in some way to be part of the discourse or participate in architecture, writing, and critical thinking, it was essential, I felt, to mime my own knowledge, especially, as one was told, in order to make any serious contribution to architecture, you had to be on the circuit. In the language of the street, which in architecture is the language of the conference corridors, you had to learn to talk a good game. The game was over, as far as I was concerned. Cleft palates, voices, still leaves, and all the words went dead the moment they came out. There in San Francisco, I became Saint-Exupéry's Little Prince. I didn't know what these grown-ups were saying, nor what they wanted. I longed for an escape to the hotel I was staying at, the Hotel Griffon. And suddenly the symbol of such a bird like the Griffon seemed appropriate for someone like me spending a year or two nearly becoming a professor. You see, if the Griffon wasn't really of the vulture family, I could live with the hallucination. Once back in the hotel jacuzzi, in conversation with a Californian school teacher, she raised the alarm of illiteracy in the state. "No one speaks anymore," she said. "In school, it is hard to encourage a conversation. Forget any exchange." It sounded familiar. The night before, I had heard an architectural student trying to defend decisions for an architectural solution so carelessly thought out, so arbitrarily constructed, that I wondered why Philip K. Dick was not reincarnated and heading the School of Architecture. The future was certainly being represented in the suburbs of the San Francisco Bay Area. The problem was, I wasn't about to be a part of that future. Sunny, fit, and with high energy, the proactive retrofitting earthquake had done what the planners couldn't do to the flyover outside my hotel window: amputate. Even here, in the shadow of Alcatraz, I felt architecture had become irresponsible. It was redundant, not only to the politicians who legislate for or against the environment, but redundant to itself as a recognizable, sustainable, and responsible discipline. I sat on the hotel bed overlooking the Bay Bridge and Alcatraz prison, trying to polish a statement to introduce my lecture. The dilemma, was it my own? There is a dilemma, I began to write. Either architecture is called to responsibility, or architecture calls each of us to answer for its wayward condition. Surf or derail. I looked out of the window. Even here in the shadow of Alcatraz, there is a very real likelihood that architecture has become redundant, not only to the politicians who legislate for or against the environment, but redundant to itself as a recognizable, sustainable discipline. I liked that line. For some reason, and encouraged, I tried something else. I paused. How could I end, I thought to myself. Can we blame the public for a wistful remembrance for an architecture which locks itself in mimesis? Can we blame the public for a nostalgia that seeks a public architecture from a past model? Is not the fragile eminence of what we heard spoken some 20 years ago replaced by the equally fragile eminence of what we speak now? I was miming knowledge. I thought I understood what I just said. But would someone else? From the hotel window, a jogger passed on the Embarcadero, reminding me that I was supposed to be more focused. Brevity and the soundbite were necessary in this world. I stared at Alcatraz and tried again. Either architecture was called to responsibility, or architecture calls each of us to answer for its wayward condition. Finished. I smiled. This was critical fatigue. The lights dimmed over the bay. I paused. How could we end all this? Sometime later that year, after I had returned from that trip to San Francisco, I received a request from the Any Architectural Journal in New York, orchestrated by Peter and friends. They had even produced one of their first journals called Writing Architecture. The phrase was familiar. Hadn't I spent years in India writing that? There was real concern, Peter's editor said, to keep your voice alive. The idea, though, that I would have to write something more on architecture, or indeed speak more and more about it in order to keep my own voice alive, frankly horrified me. I was in near panic. It was suicide time. So close to a vomit moment, I hurriedly dispatched a note to New York describing that I had spent the last 6 months writing a children's book in which I was doing everything I could to put my tongue away. It remained to be seen, of course, whether anyone would publish that book in which the main character, an inaction hero called Rodolfo, was a fugitive from the opera La Bohème. Rodolfo came from the wrong century and was in love with a character called Buffo, just as I was. And Rodolfo would be trying to come to terms, not with all that dumb snow he has spent his winters under, not with all this dumb snow outside this lecture hall, but with all the wise men in the forest that seem to prevent us from acknowledging that, as the Finnish poet Haavikko had said, ultimately there was and is not one stupid tree. A paradox indeed. All those wise men in architecture over the years, yet not one stupid tree. It was around that time that I felt like disowning myself. What was this irresponsibility? Was this a realization that I had studied, learnt, and been released into a world in architecture with such a poor, critical, and practical grasp of the knowledge of architecture itself? If over the years architects have attempted to use architecture as an alibi of emptiness and pretense, what then of our own melancholia and pretense? Is that why I could never be an architect, never build the darkness inside me? Was it not then, is it not now, the time to come out and welcome each other to our own irresponsible selves? Of course, it is possible to retreat within architecture, irresponsibly too. But in this almost godless position, once more, we are repeating and trailing Nietzsche, Camus, Havel, and others. the architect, the student, the planet all have to rethink what it means to live the truth. What is the courage to be today when we are in the middle of things, neither able to begin again or to conclude? So finally, to salute our irresponsible selves, I return to poetry. This is a poem called Little Johnny's Confession. It's by a Liverpool poet called Brian Patten. And it's called Little Johnny's Final Letter. And this is our clue. Architecture today needs to write its final letter to get on with being not what it can no longer be, but what it should be, enriching a human, and if it has to be, an irresponsible future. Mother, I won't be home this evening, so don't worry. Don't hurry to report me missing. Don't drain the canals to find me. I've decided to stay alive. Don't search the woods. I'm not hiding. Simply gone to get myself classified. Don't leave my shreddies out. I've done with security. Don't circulate my photograph to society. I've disguised myself as a man, and I'm giving priority to obscurity. It suits me fine. I've taken off my short trousers and put on long ones. And now I'm going out into the city. So don't worry. Don't hurry to report me missing. I've rented a room without curtains and sit behind the windows growing cold. Heard your plea on the radio this morning. You sounded sad and strangely old. That's a book called The Irresponsible Self, which discusses the notion of irresponsibility, and that perhaps today, perhaps some of our most responsible acts might have to come through being irresponsible to other acts. Some of you know Bruno Zevi. How many in this room know Bruno Zevi? About 5. Okay. Just for those of you who don't know, Bruno Zevi was one of those. You don't have many of these characters left in world architecture today. Kenneth Frampton is one. They're men of huge reading beyond architecture. Zevi was one. Bruno Zevi was an Italian critic, scholar, and I would say we would have probably one left today remaining, and that would be Kenneth Frampton. These figures have a certain role in society, and Bruno Zevi didn't particularly like Alvar Aalto. I never quite understood why, but I discussed it with him in the late 1990s, and he asked me if I would write an anti-Aalto book. And I said, well, I wasn't that keen on just writing an anti-Alvar Aalto book, because, I mean, there's a certain things you need to know about Alvar Aalto, and it's quite complex if you study. Well, I did write a book in the end called Aaltomania, which I think I recommend any of you want to look at it. It is about the notion of how an architect gets expanded to beyond the work they've done and just becomes a reflection of very much which is applied to Aalto himself. That one's called Aaltomania. But at the same time, I was asked by the Swedish newspaper to prepare some ideas on Alvar Aalto, and instead of poetry this time, I said